This is Sg2 Perspectives, a conversation with Sg2 experts and industry thought leaders about the biggest trends in healthcare and what we expect that's going to mean for the future of healthcare delivery.
The other main point of concern here is the ongoing inpatient-outpatient shift in terms of procedural activity. This has been going on for 20 years. This was Sg2's claim to fame 20 years ago to anticipate it. So those inpatient facilities, it's kind of doom and gloom between payer mix shifts and that accelerated outpatient shift. Outpatient is completely the opposite. It's an incredibly optimistic story.
Welcome to Sg2 Perspectives. I'm your host for today's episode, Jayme Zage. Today, I have my colleagues, Justin Cassidy and Mike Humphrey with me, and they're here to talk about the 2024 AMC Summit that was hosted in San Francisco. What I'd really love to know, Mike and Justin, is about the pivotal moments. The Sg2 theme for the year was pivotal moments. For AMCs, what are the most important pivotal moments that you highlighted at the summit this year?
Maybe we can just alternate those, Justin, because there are plenty of them to go around. Part of the most difficult thing was to narrow them down. I'll start with one of those that we found most important, and that was the whole issue of advocating for your equity mission. One of the things that have been so challenging is in a time of uneven margin recovery and then also other capital investments, particularly large billion-dollar facility investments, is to keep the dollars available to address some of those gaps that we've identified in terms of equity and access. As things shift from the federal level because of the evaporation of the CARES Act, it's becoming even more difficult to find those dollars. And so it really requires hyper-localization of efforts and energy and connection to address those. So I think that would be one of the first pivotal moments.
Justin, tell me about your next pivotal moment.
The second pivotal moment that we described in our AMC Summit was the fact that academic medical centers have evolved into systems, and they have now been pivoting to accelerate that systemness to enhance and sustain their sustainability. What exemplifies this more than anything is an analysis we did earlier in the year where we actually identified of the about 400 total health systems in the United States, those 98 academic systems that truly have a quadripartite mission. There are about 35 systems that have an emerging academic status. In addition, there's a growing cohort of that sort. Of those 98 academic health systems, 33 have undergone mergers and acquisitions in the last 2 years. A pivotal moment as you've acquired a facility to thinking about operating as a unit. UCSF Health, our very gracious and wonderful co-host, exemplifies this, and they had partnership with 2 Dignity hospitals in the San Francisco area, St. Mary's and St. Francis. Those have led to acquisitions. They've been very recent, still intertwining from an operational point of view, but considering co-location of services, thinking about continuing to have tertiary quaternary care services at their Parnassus and Mission Bay campuses, but perhaps leveraging St. Francis and St. Mary's to have a burn unit and inpatient psychiatry. Of those clearly academic systems, the vast majority have had other pivots in addition to mergers and acquisitions, but it's that systemness, that true operational intertwinement that's really pivotal.
While we were there, they were approved for the merger and announced that it had been finalized. But what's interesting, we also had Chris Watts, who's the CSO of BJC Health System, which is in the Missouri and St. Louis area. They've been building a system for over a decade now, and they've built multiple hospitals across their area. But at the same time, in parallel fashion, they've created what's been known as the BJC Collaborative. And that is an effort with non-owned other health systems, 8 other health systems in total. And part of that work was really to find and identify ways that they could work together on initiatives of both administrative and clinical. It was a wet lab for looking at these opportunities, defining cultures, capabilities, things that would work well from a system perspective. And Chris gave us some really interesting advice through all that effort. One, he said that this whole journey to systemness can be both an internal and external journey. It can also be very taxing on the organization and the people involved in it. He spoke about a couple of external capabilities. Those were about building trust. And that trust over time can really prepare them to execute on opportunities at almost a moment's notice. It's what Chris referred to as being the ready position most of the time. And in fact, that happened with their merger with St. Luke's when the CEO that they'd been working with for 12 years retired. They knew that the opportunity to work together more closely in a more asset-owned approach would work well. So they built that trust and that expectation and understanding over a decade, and they were ready in that position.
What's interesting, Mike, that BJC is one of 7 health academic systems that has multiple academic medical centers within their fold at this point. It's not just integrating community hospitals, it's integrating other academic medical centers. The other example I'd like to give is Dr. Fritz Francois from NYU Health. And in their journey to systemness, they started to realize that, in Dr. Francois's words, the good news is that we have a wealth of data. The bad news is that we have a wealth of data. As they started looking at the activities, the clinical quality between acquired hospitals within their system, between the boroughs, they started seeing some differences. And they actually used that opportunity in their growth in systemness to achieve equity through quality improvement initiatives. So really inspiring the physicians within their fold to say, hey, look, everybody should get the same care, raising their already excellent care to stellar levels between all of the different sites. Their growing system includes 2 schools of medicine, another example of a multi-mission AMC, 6 inpatient hospitals, and over 350 outpatient locations, and really thinking about enhancing quality to reduce experiential disparities between those different facilities. It's a really inspirational story.
It's an interesting contrast between NYU and BJC. In the case of NYU, they actually operate their institutions under one license, so one Medicare provider. The outcomes they're holding themselves responsible for, regardless of where the care delivered, is under one organization. Whereas you think about BJC, the way they manage what has been traditional intra-system competition, so hospitals within the same system competing, they called it authority with congenial control. Chris explained is if 2 hospitals have overlapping markets and they both have sort of similar initiatives trying to grow their organization, serve the patients appropriately, they would have to come to an understanding and solve that. But the ultimate rule or arbitration was whatever lifted the system the best, meaning the system's commitments to the overall community, is the best. So it's almost like resolving disputes between your 2 children. You want them to grow and develop as individuals and have interests, but at the same time, at some point, you have to manage that. As long as that authority with congenial control was instituted uniformly, it really helped with execution and systemness at the larger system.
As we think about systemness from the academic side, those AMCs turning into academic systems, not center to system, other health systems are doing a similar journey. They're becoming more academic in nature and acquiring schools of medicine of their own, of tightening those affiliations, creating more graduate medical education programs, most importantly, perhaps becoming clinical trial sites of their own.
Mike and Justin, that's some amazing insights on systemness. And I know that's been a topic that we've been trying to cover and tackle for eons. And hear that there's maybe even some advancement on clinical systemness and that clinical connectivity across the system, how that impacts the overall quality of care. Totally amazing. As we talk about the clinical performance and also shift to one of your other pivotal moments, the revenue opportunity with ambulatory. And Justin, you also mentioned this concept with one of the systems in New York with 350 sites outside the hospitals. Tell me more about this ambulatory care and that vast revenue opportunity as a pivotal moment.
That's not atypical of systems to have at least an order of magnitude more outpatient locations than inpatient. Most systems would be hard pressed to be able to name all of their outpatient facilities. Certainly when we talk to hospital-based health systems, they are focused on inpatient facilities still. And the other main point of concern here is the ongoing inpatient-outpatient shift in terms of procedural activity. This has been going on for 20 years. This was SG2's claim to fame 20 years ago to anticipate it. Those inpatient facilities, it's kind of doom and gloom between payer mix shifts and that accelerated outpatient shift. Outpatient is completely the opposite. It's an incredibly optimistic story. It's all about growth and opportunity. There's another case in point we'd like to share, and that's Kaufman Hall, Vizian's consulting data partner. They've been tracking margin recovery throughout 2023 as the industry has experienced a fair bit of contraction into 2024, and it's clearly looking much more favorable now as an industry with an average of about 4% profit margin. However, when you dig into that number, you see increasing variation between the low performers and the high performers, where the low performers might be a negative 20% margin, high performers might be nearing 30%. What's the difference between the high performers and low performers? And when they dig into it, it's almost universally that the high performers have successfully shifted their strategic focus to start to capture that vast ambulatory revenue potential. And they're doing this in a variety of ways, scaling their clinical care with asynchronous care models like email visits or even text-based encounters, embracing digital scale to help accomplish that. They're vertically integrating ancillary services, thinking about labs or pathology, creating joint ventures with ambulatory surgery groups. More than anything, it's exploring the vast revenue potential of pharmacy.
Pharmacy is something that has just skyrocketed to the top of folks' minds. It was that quiet thing. I joked with Justin when I was administrative resident in the hospital. A couple of things were in the basement, my office for one, but next to that was supply chain, all the warehousing stuff that was there, sterile processing, and then pharmacy. Humble beginnings of pharmacy being based out of the basement of a hospital. It is now front and center. In many ways, specialty pharmacy and even 340B revenue account for significant, if not greater than half the revenue of most institutions these days. As that's grown in terms of the clinical innovation, the therapeutic application, so too has the complexity of managing those costs. And so we think about pharmacy benefit managers as being that intermediary. In many ways, their intended role of making sure the formulary also passed along the appropriate cost savings to the employers who were covered under the plans that were structured through the PBMs, that's come into question and in a broad arena, both at the federal level and state level. But for AMCs, it could represent an opportunity while this disruption is occurring to really think about what role do they play. And there's a couple that we've seen play out by these institutions. One of those, the dependency on the revenue, even going back to our comments around equity, funding that equity mission could be very much supported through this continued revenue. And the intention actually of 340B is to make sure that pharmaceuticals are equitably affordable for folks. A lot of organizations have chief pharmacy officers. Those folks are very much becoming point and center for coordination of strategic efforts and clinical coordination. That role is going to be incredibly important. In many ways, Justin and I have talked about the concept of monitoring pharmacy leakage. The same way that organizations are so focused on surgical leakage, paying the same attention to make sure that if a script is written, first that it's filled, and then if it's kept within that system in terms of coordination, everything from medical management to the appropriateness and to adherence. And we're starting to see AMCs look at ways where they can play a unique role here. We gave them a couple of case examples during the summit. UNC is developing their own PBM, and they're hoping to market that to employers within the Carolinas, really on the backbone and the expertise of their pharmacists and their technology platform. And we know of another healthcare-owned collaboration between Illuma Health and Mayo Clinic. The ownership is appealing to many organizations because they're acting on behalf of the patients, and that has a strong clinical background and perhaps not as complex, or it's more transparent than we're seeing in the PBMs. And that's what's being called into question in the open arena.
The clinician-led PBMs is really inspiring, more so than an administrator making some of these decisions on what is or off of a formulary. The other is hospital-based specialty pharmacies curating those medicines, making sure that the supply chain, the cold chain is maintained throughout in terms of storage. A lot of these products are perishable, and accounting for that is important. It's much easier to be done at a centrally located hospital specialty pharmacy. I'm really glad you pointed out the cross-subsidization from pharmacy revenues of the mission. In many ways, academic medical centers are starting very behind. They need to be relocating a lot of that margin to sustain medical education, to enhance clinical research activities, and most importantly, sustain that health equity mission. Getting this revenue from the outpatient side, embracing your ambulatory revenue potential is absolutely critical to growing. We're starting to see and monitor some of these external disruptors in the pharmacy space. It's discouraging because they could be directly competing for that 340B revenue and disrupt those revenue streams. This buy and bill model is often what's happening at some of these direct-to-consumer companies. And by the way, these direct-to-consumer companies have accelerated in their margin capture. So we're talking about this 4% industry average for hospitals and health systems. Well, HIMSS just released their Q3 quarterly earnings report. They're making 80% profit margin. Thinking about these potential disruptors as, yes, they are competitive threats, but there also might be something to learn from their activities from a hospital-based perspective. Is it the enhanced consumerism? Is it the asynchronous models? Is it the convenience, the online access? Is it the destigmatization of services? Is there anything we can replicate as an industry? And then finally, we really shouldn't neglect the fact that 98% of all procedural activity happens in the outpatient space. So from a pure volume play, in addition to growth, this is where the action is.
You mentioned a couple of things in particular, Justin, about the disruptors, and your last pivotal moment that you talked about during the AMC Summit had to do with anticipating those future pivots. I'm actually surprised to hear you say that academic medical centers have been slow in this, because in my perspective, they've led the way in innovation, at least in clinical innovation. How do they balance that? What do they need to do to leverage their academic edge?
Joshua Adler from UCSF Health gave a great quote that exemplifies the impact of disruptors. He mentioned that AI is quite helpful and also a huge distraction. All of these clinical innovations, and we'll give an example of 4 monumental pivots that we pointed out during our presentation that we think are truly game-changing. Developing them is the purview of your clinical research teams, brilliant scientists that work at academic medical centers that really propel the future of discovery. Enacting those into clinical care models, being able to derive sustainable revenue stream from them in order to sustain that activity, in order to enhance access to patients, particularly government pay patients, is a challenge. We gave 4 examples. The first is that we are in a golden era of drug discovery. We have RNA therapeutics. We have more modalities than ever. We have small peptides that are essentially behavioral change catalysts for anti-obesity medicines, hundreds in the pipeline in these new drug categories and classes.
The innovation that AMCs have been known for, as you get into some of those more advanced cell and gene therapies, you have to be a qualified treatment center to administer and participate. That's still an opportunity for AMCs to distinguish themselves along that particular line of opportunity.
100%. Our second is gene therapies, and the fact that QTCs and the like need to be enacted in order to even administer these therapies. Those centers that conducted the clinical trials for gene therapies often get grandfathered into the C status. So there's a differentiator as you are actually thinking about what clinical trials to have. That's increasingly becoming clinical care. And in fact, we heard from Dr. Nicholas Holmes at UCSF Health that clinical trials often are the best clinical care. And UCSF Health does such a fantastic job in this space. Some of our panels as well were talking about fetal intervention surgery as it's now not being delivered by a scalpel, but by a gene therapy, and really inspiring stuff at UCSF Health. But across the country, we're continuing to hear significant challenges. We see new therapies approved for sickle cell disease and hemophilia in the last year. That's fantastic, but it's the financial models that now require innovation. The third that we think is a potential truly monumental pivot is the progression of diagnostic activity to much earlier in life. Thinking about Mass General Brigham researchers investigating, saying that there's even some evidence of blood-based biomarkers of neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease of patients in their 20s. If you can start to identify and recruit patients into clinical trials earlier in life, before that neurodegeneration happens, clearly a game changer for drug development and reducing that burden of disease. For cancer care, earlier diagnostic activity is already well underway, identifying cancer previvors. Clearly, payers are still not on board with population-based screening, but many savvy systems are starting to think about population health initiatives that could yield better cancer channel strategy. And we heard from Andy Dorr at the OSU, and they've just announced a new partnership with Helix. They're not alone. Many other systems have similar partnerships, but it's essentially in part a cancer channel strategy play. By identifying from a population health perspective, those that might be at increased risk of cancer, we can better serve our population earlier with increased escalation of screening procedures and clearly cancer treatment when it's more effective.
That is encouraging news to have that earlier diagnostic, because we're starting to see actually the epidemiology. While we might be living longer, we're starting to see some of these either cardiac conditions or even cancers present earlier than in the age range that we typically think of. So that combination could really be a unique opportunity for these early diagnostics, and particularly the role that AMCs might play.
We're starting to see more liquid biopsies approved to detect active cancer in the case of GRAIL, in the case of specific types of cancer, blood-based tests to essentially screen for colorectal cancer being approved this year. It's here now, but whether payers are going to be reimbursing is still a challenge.
If you look at those, we classified those as monumental pivots, but we thought there were a couple of things that organizations should be prepared for that are probably more so pivots in the moment. A few of those that we thought were particularly important, and this is not just AMCs, but certainly cybersecurity. We saw the impact of Change Health and what that meant in terms of delayed care. As we go to cell and gene therapy, the personal information that's captured, and we've been hearing about 23andMe and what happens with their genetic assets once they maybe are not a sustainable business entity as they are today. So that cybersecurity goes beyond the financials. It's personal and even individually genetic materials that could be at risk. So those safeguards need to be enacted. Another potential surge we've seen are the closures of rural hospitals across the country. My family, they live in a town that has about a 50-bed hospital that I am continuously concerned about the close of that hospital, which would put them an hour to an hour and a half away from any type of emergent care, and particularly chronic care, regular visits. As those potentially 700 hospitals close, we've increasingly seen where the academic medical centers have been asked, either at the state or purely by their own commitment to the communities around them, to step in and provide some level of care, from ambulatory to even revitalizing that site for inpatient select services. That is a surge that I think we need to, as a country, pay attention to. But Justin, I know there are other surges you thought were equally important.
Oh, there are so many, unfortunately, that have to be contended with, that have to be anticipated, that savvy hospital planners are incorporating in terms of crisis management training and anticipation within their facilities, the escalations of patient violence, the mass casualty events, weather-related crises, as we see the impact of hurricanes, both directly on hospital-based services and then indirectly in terms of supply chain disruption, potentially compromising surgical. The other very important one moving forward is going to be the impact of organized labor and disruption of surgical services. We see this impacting many academic medical centers, and with physician unions taking hold, particularly with residents, this could be very challenging for our tertiary hub centers to make sure that call is maintained.
As we think about all of these different pivots and these events that are coming up, what's the one or two things that each of you think academic medical centers need to do to be able to prepare to make those pivots?
I'll start with one that's not necessarily rationale-based or analytically based. One of our keynotes from UCSF said, so much of being able to adapt for this surge of surges or the forward pivots, it's about the ability of an organization to adapt to change quickly. Historically, we either fairly or unfairly tend to say that AMCs are slow and deliberate in their processes and decision-making. And Cynthia Bargenier, who is the president of the Adult Services at UCF, made a very humorous, spot-on comment. She said, the only people interested in change are wet babies. While incredibly humorous, her point was all of these things require incredibly resilient and prepared, culturally aligned organization and staff from the front lines. We talk a lot about organizational behavior and its impact and ability for AMCs to be prepared for these. It's about that ability to change and do so in a resilient manner and to bring everybody along and feeling informed and part of the solution. That's not necessarily an analytic or a trend, but it's certainly important.
Double down on partnerships, that type of activity. It can be a precursor to M&A, as we saw with UCSF Health and the Dignity facilities, but often it's incredibly productive, so long as it's aligned with a very clear strategic why. We had the absolute pleasure of Morgan Jones from Duke Health joining and talking about partnerships. There's an industry shift from defensive partnerships to those that are more on the offense, that is to achieve something rather than prevent something. That's really inspirational. Andy Dorff agreed with this take and is at the OSU more aware of missed opportunities, perhaps thinking that the industry is a bit too risk averse. And like that HIMSS example with sky high profit margin, are there opportunities that we should be exploring that are not on our strategic radar historically, but perhaps it's from lack of imagination? We had the absolute pleasure of closing our academic medical center and Children's Hospital Summit with a joint panel discussion. We had Mike Haccio from Mass General Brigham, we had Nicole Polk from IU Health, and Dr. Todd Ponsky from Cincinnati Children's. And collectively, they gave an outstanding perspective, thinking about kind of the runway of revenue generation from an ancillary revenue stream and innovation. It can be long. Now in 2024, a major and actually really helpful pivot in the industry is a shift from cost cutting and reaction to COVID to one of full-blown growth mode. And when you have growth, particularly if you're enjoying a decent margin, you have the opportunity to invest in the future. And the structures of their innovation teams are set up in really intriguing ways in which to explore and capture these ancillary revenue opportunities. So certainly continue to pivot, be creative, and use strategy to guide those investment opportunities.
Thank you. Those are some great insights about all the great insights that were shared at the AMC Summit this year. For our audience members, our Sg2 Perspective listeners, if you missed the AMC Summit and would like to attend next year, our event in 2025 is going to be in July in Chicago in conjunction with the Children's Hospital Summit, but also our Executive Summit. So you get kind of a 3-for-1 and a chance to really learn across and meet not only your academic peers, but also your community hospital peers as well. So thank you all for listening today on Sg2 Perspectives.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review us, and/or follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn at Sg2 Healthcare. And if you want to talk more about innovative healthcare strategies, you can always email me at sg2perspectives@sg2.com. Finally, Sg2 is a Vizient company, and there are a bunch of Vizient podcasts that you might like. You can find them at Vizient /podcasts. Have a great day.